So my name's Margaret Anderson, and I head a group called Faster Cures. We're based here in Washington, D.C., but we're part of another group in California called the Milken Institute. So our founder is Mike Milken, who is known as a medical philanthropist. Some of you may have heard of the Prostate Cancer Foundation, which is a group that he started after his own diagnosis, and that was about 18 years ago. So what I am going to talk to you about today is a report that is shown up here called Back to Basics. This is a piece that we released, I guess, about a year and a half ago, and it was a co-authored project between Faster Cures and HCM Strategists, and that's a group that Michael Manganello works with. They do public policy here in DC, and so Michael and I took this on because we had been to many meetings, over our maybe last 5 years in medical research advocacy, where people would sort of wax poetic about the days of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, which sounds a bit strange, but what we would hear is, if we could just do what they did, and they had it right. And Michael and I weren't convinced that people truly understood the model, and we felt like people knew pieces of the story but really didn't know the whole story. So we just sort of hatched this idea, kind of harebrained a little bit, of why don't we try to go find some of the activists that we knew were still in the field and interview them about their experience and see if we could come up with some common themes in terms of what happened and what they did. So we kind of put our resources together and came up with a list of folks and reached out to all of them and said, here's what we're thinking about doing. And every single person said, we would love to talk about it. So it was actually not that difficult to get time with a lot of these people. And when you can download this report from the fastercures.org site, and what you'll see is that there are many names that you'll recognize. Tony Fauci is one of them, and he still heads the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. But another name that you probably have heard about, and you'll hear more later, is Commissioner Margaret Hamburg, who is the current Food and Drug Administration Commissioner. Peggy was the Assistant Director of NIAID under Tony Fauci, and so we interviewed her. Jim Curran, who worked at the Centers for Disease Control in the early days of the epidemic and is still at Emory University chairing the Public Health Department. David Kessler, who was another FDA commissioner, and a number of others. Larry Kramer is another person that you may have heard. Did anybody in the audience know Larry Kramer's name? So Larry Kramer is he's a playwright, still working, wrote a play called The Normal Heart, which I would encourage you to see if it comes around. But he also was one of the founders of ACT UP. And so we went up to Larry's apartment in Greenwich Village and said, we'd like to interview about this. And it was interesting, his experience and his reaction when we went up there, because he said, why are you doing this again? And we said, well, we want to kind of characterize what are the lessons learned. And we don't think that activists know the full story. And he said, well, what's their problem exactly? What do you think what's the issue for them? And we were telling him about, various groups that we worked with, disease groups that couldn't quite get the attention they needed to their issue, or they weren't quite making the progress they needed. And he said, well, why don't they just sort of take matters into their own hands? I mean, he was really befuddled by this. And so we were explaining some of the complexities, which of course he knew because he had lived through an epidemic. But he told us a story about, in his co-op apartment in Greenwich Village, that there was a group of older ladies who had, all access to the senior center downtown in New York City, and the city was going to shut down the senior center. And so these little old ladies came to him and said, Larry, what can we do? And he said, well, here's what you got to do first. You've got to all go down to the lobby of this building and bring all your wheelchairs and your walkers and everything that looks terrible about being old. And then you need to get out of them really dramatically. First, you have to call the news outlets and tell them that little old ladies are going to be protesting, and get them all there, and then lay down in the middle of the lobby and just take it over and scream and make a lot of noise, and you see if that does something. So he said that the ladies created their own campaign and, of course, saved the senior center. But he was talking about one of the elements of the model. So I'm going to walk you through this movement. So the movement was really about creating change, but it really sort of happened, I think, by accident. And so when we went and started talking to some of the activists, one of them said, look, we were all infected or terrified of being infected, and one of the things we wanted was just access to information. Or as the government started to do research, we wanted access to clinical trials. So we found that kind of interesting that here this big movement with a lot of impressive results was created around access to information. So this slide illustrates some of the key accomplishments, and you're going to be hearing later, I saw from your agenda, about different things related to NIH funding. Emil is going to talk about FDA policy, and some of the sort of pioneering things that the agencies are still using in the Ryan White CARE Act, which is about care delivery, were really a result of this movement. So this is just kind of a snapshot of what came out of that movement. But I think probably for you all, the most impressive thing and the most important thing is that right now, today, there are 33 drugs that have been approved by the FDA to treat HIV. So we went from a situation of not even understanding what the virus was to having 33 drugs. Now, probably already some of you are thinking, okay, well, this is not the same as what my disease is, because maybe I'm an N of 10 or 20 or 500, and it's really difficult to get our groups harnessed. But we're going to talk a little bit about that in terms of some of the elements of the model. So what are the elements? The first that I'll talk about is getting attention, and I previewed a little bit of that about Larry Kramer's story in ACT UP. How many of you remember the days, these sort of early days of, AIDS politics, if you will? You know, when we would see on the nightly news, when we all still sat down and watched the nightly news, that they would be chaining themselves to the doors of the FDA, the NIH, disrupting Wall Street, all sorts of civil disobedience. And then as the movement evolved, there would be other ways to get attention. So we had the AIDS quilt, which shown on the National Mall 2 or 3 times. And if you had occasion to go see that, there would be family members around the quilt of their loved one who had passed away. They would usually have a podium, basically 24/7, where people would be reading the names of people who had died. And this was right, basically out the front door of the United States Capitol and the White House. So it was another opportunity to say, you can't ignore this. People are dying. We need to take action. So the second piece is knowledge and solutions. And when Michael and I took on this project, this was really, I think for us, the reason that we wanted to do it is that we wanted to make clear to our fellow advocates and activists that in order to affect change, you actually have to have some ideas. And it's not enough to just go and create the disturbance. You actually have to have something to give. And I'll give you some of the examples of how that happened. The third thing was this sense of community, and that came through loud and clear, and you guys are sort of living and breathing that right now. We talked to many of the activists who just said how terrified they were, how afraid they were about the future. Many of them were sick and dying, and they hadn't even identified what the problems were. So the creation of this community was very powerful for them in terms of some of the weekly meetings that took place in various cities as an opportunity to share information. Now, and we'll talk about some of the elements that have changed, now we have social media. So you don't necessarily have to get together physically to create community, and there are pluses and minuses with that model. So the fourth is accountability, and they used tactics of sort of inside accountability within the movement and then outside accountability. How are they holding people accountable in positions of power? And it wasn't just the federal government, it was also the industry, it was academic medicine, really anyone who was getting in the way of the progress that they thought needed to happen. The fifth thing is leadership, and this is also a case of internal leadership within the movement, but external leadership. And we heard a little bit about that in the last presentation, and you're going to hear about it from others, is that you need to be looking for champions in a lot of different places. As you all go to Capitol Hill tomorrow, you need to be cultivating champions, certainly within these agencies, within companies, basically anyone who you can get the ear of who is going to be of assistance. And I think many of you in this room have found champions, but you've probably also found detractors that you either had to sort of mow through or just ignore and move on and get to somebody else. So let's talk about the first piece of the model, the attention. So this is a quote from Mark Harrington, who was with ACT UP. I will also point out that many of these activists that I'm going to be talking about are featured in a documentary film called How to Survive a Plague. And this was in the movie theaters for a short while. It was nominated for a Best Documentary and didn't win the other night, but I would encourage you to take a look at it. I think one of the most powerful things of the documentary is that you see footage of these individuals in the middle of the epidemic, and so you see sort of the panic, the fear, some of the physical manifestations that they themselves were dealing with, and then at the end, you see many of them today sort of kind of looking surprised, like, I can't believe that we actually came through this. So the getting attention piece was one thing that obviously was very powerful and important. And if you were with us last night at the film showing, the Hear Us Now documentary, you heard from Hugh Hempel about basically taking some of that power, and also from Chris Austin, who heads NCATS at the NIH, saying, you really have to seek attention and get it. And I would encourage all of you, I said this last night, as you're going up on Capitol Hill, don't mince words. Really be clear about what you want to see change and what you need. Yes, there's civility and there's a need for that, but I think one of the hallmarks of the AIDS activists was they were fighting for their lives, and they felt very clearly and strongly about that. So my own personal experience in terms of getting attention, I worked at the American Public Health Association, which is a large trade association here in Washington. Tends to be a little, I wouldn't say politically conservative, but conservative in its ideals. And I was hired to run their HIV/AIDS policy. And this was in the early 90s. And one of the things that we decided to do was to hold a policy meeting around the Social Security disability definition. Only in Washington would you have a policy meeting about that. The reason we were doing it is that as our knowledge in the epidemic and the caseload started to increase, the Social Security Administration had to deal with that because people were going on disability. So there had to be a list of medical conditions that they could look at to say, are you disabled, or are you eligible for this? Well, because the epidemic began in men primarily in the United States, most of the conditions related to sort of either general opportunistic infections or male-specific. So there were more and more women becoming infected and dying, living for a while being HIV positive. And so one of the precursors, one of the opportunistic infections was cervical cancer. So we were having a discussion around that. Should cervical cancer, was the science there to include it as an indicator? And it was a small policy meeting, maybe 25 people. It was a variety of different stakeholders. And we didn't invite ACT UP. And ACT UP decided that they felt like they needed a seat at the table. So they, in this kind of small conference room, in this not very forward-thinking association, they dramatically opened the doors in the middle of the meeting, marched in, did their chant about acting up, fighting back, and basically took out handcuffs and started to handcuff my participants to the chairs. I happened to have a boss who was a very, wise individual who, he was not handcuffed. He walked upstairs to the executive director, who was kind of an old-timey public health guy. And he came downstairs and he said, you know what, you guys, we're not going to call the police. We want you to stay. We want you to participate in this conversation. We want to hear what you have to say. People are a little uncomfortable with the handcuffing. They might have to go to the bathroom. Can you please take the handcuffs off? And slowly, the dialogue continued. They had legal counsel because at every demonstration they had somebody who was appointed to be their lawyer. And the legal counsel kind of did her formal piece and said, I'm Urvashi Vaid, and I'm no longer legal counsel right now of ACT UP. I'm a participant in the meeting. She sat down, and off we went and continued the meeting. As a young, new professional, it was a little terrifying to have your meeting explode that way. But what did it teach me? It taught me that people who want to affect change, might be willing to do anything, especially when they're fighting for their lives. And I remember just feeling after that, I would never again feel shy about saying something in a meeting, or sort of be muzzled, if you will. And I think that that's an important thing for you all to think about. Are you all going to walk around with handcuffs now and take those to your meetings? Probably not. But these individuals did. Now, what did that do? I mean, many of you, I'm sure, have read pieces about what the AIDS activists did, but it created a bit of a fear culture. Is that always going to be the most effective thing? Probably not, but it did get everybody's attention. That was one thing that we talked to all the activists about. Now, what I'm going to talk about in a minute is how there was that piece in terms of getting attention, but then they had to get smart. So this is a slide of Jim Curran, and he says you have to be able to inspire people at a level of civil disobedience. Now, I worked, again, at this Public Health Association. I went to many meetings where Jim Curran would be speaking. Some of these were international AIDS conferences. Some of them were, maybe 1,000-person meetings. I specifically remember one meeting where he stood at the podium giving his talk. Again, it was around women and HIV issues. And the activists this time, they didn't bring handcuffs, they brought rolls of toilet paper. And they strategically placed themselves basically in the perimeter of the room and started tossing the toilet paper around the room. Now, that could happen in a 6th grade classroom, but it happened at this conference. And pretty soon the entire room was blanketed in toilet paper. And they had noisemakers and all sorts of other things. And Jim Curran just kept on with his talk, and then he kind of stopped and he said, let's have a dialogue. I think that was one of the things that we all witnessed was people that could have turned into foes, turned into allies because they said, there's no point in fighting this. I agree with you. I'm trying to change the system too. So you had kind of the inside-outside system starting to work together. Here's a photograph that shows some of the civil disobedience. And I think in the video that or the documentary that I mentioned, How to Survive a Plague, there were some images of protesters on the NIH campus. So the situation's different today after 9/11, and everyone realized that on the NIH campus, they deal with biological materials and all sorts of other things that you wouldn't want to just have anyone get access to. They had to put up a big fence around the NIH. And if you've been out there, you know that you have to go through a fairly involved security process. So when you see these images, it's even more powerful because the activists could just march onto the campus and they would take over for several days. So this is where Tony Fauci comes in. So Tony was a fairly young, really, really brilliant scientist, administrator of NIAID. Here he was, basically overseeing the federal research effort for NIH. So when we went to interview Tony and, just kind of ask him about this experience, our question to him was, well, when do you first remember that you started to think, hey, they've got something here, they've got some ideas to offer? And he was talking about one of the big protests, and he said he was walking across campus, and he was clearly being looked at as one of the leaders on the NIH campus of what should we be doing about this? Should we be inviting the activists in? How do we want to have a dialogue? What do we want to do? And he said that they had, maybe it was like a 10-point manifesto. And he said he reached down, picked up this piece of paper, and looked at this manifesto of all the things that needed to change. And it reminds me, Hugh, of your slide that you showed last night of things in the system that needed to happen. And he said he started to read them, and he realized, wow, 7 out of 10 of these pretty good ideas. Not things that we've fully thought through, but things we need to deal with and look at. So he said for him, it was a little bit of a light bulb moment of, he said they were already starting to interact with the activists, but it was that moment of, okay, we need to sit down and have a discussion and figure this out together. So this, I think, was the part about getting knowledge and solutions that struck us, was that they did their own due diligence about what the system was and what it should be. And I remarked last night that they did it in a pre-internet era. So they did it through transfer of papers in bankers' boxes, fax machines, if anybody can remember those. They would be faxing information back and forth. They organized teach-ins, and so in apartments in New York City, they would say, tonight we're going to learn about the clinical trial system, and they would designate a person who would be the leader who would talk about what that system was. And they would post papers all over the place. They had legal expertise amongst them, people who had worked on Wall Street, who understood the financing of medical research. So they really kind of figured out what's the information we need to know and how do we go get that. So this is a quote from Peggy Hamburg. Peggy talks about how they really brought a very sophisticated understanding to the table. She told us a story about how she and Tony Fauci were invited up to one of these weekly meetings in Greenwich Village. And she said it was the early days of the epidemic. There really wasn't anything that they had yet in terms of medicines to offer. So it was really at the crisis point. And she said it was unnerving to be sure to walk into this setting. But she said, once they made it clear that they were here to listen, to partake in this dialogue, that they were able to form quite a partnership. So David Kessler, again, he remarked to us about the sophistication of the members. So I keep bringing this up to all of you because there's never enough hours in the day, particularly if you're dealing with someone in your family who has an illness. But I think that, the story that we learned here is that if they hadn't taken the time to get smart, to read every article, to understand, to ask questions, to figure out what they didn't know, I'm not sure that they would have had the same response in terms of being invited in. So you also had a situation where things were exploding all over the world, and so you had people who not just had to pay attention to what was happening in the United States, they had to pay attention globally and figure out who was doing something better. And I think across the board in medical research, it's something that we're starting to look at closely in Faster Cures, is that there are a lot of really innovative things happening globally right now. So despite the economic crisis that Europe has been undergoing, the European community has been really kind of forklifting money into some of these areas of drug development. And so groups like ours are trying to get smart as quickly as we can about what they're doing, because I think given some of the things you're going to hear about later with funding in the federal research system, I'm not saying the United States is done, but I think that there's a lot of other countries in the world that are paying very close attention to the life sciences. They see it as an economic opportunity, a jobs opportunity, and the situation's going to look, I think, dramatically different in another 5 to 10 years. Now, I'm talking about Europe. Obviously, in Asia, in China, in Singapore, their investment in the life sciences in China will clearly leapfrog over what the United States is offering. So it's just something else for you to keep in mind, and that is, I think, one of the positives about the internet, social media, is the ability to pay attention to what's going on overseas. So the next one was community. I talked about some of these meetings. This person is Jim Igo. Jim was just an amazing, amazing person to talk with. He is HIV negative and basically lived through the epidemic and ultimately sort of stepped out of it because of some of the politics. So it was a really emotional interview with him as he sat and kind of reflected on this history in his life that I'm not sure he thinks about every single day, but the number of people who were positive that passed away. He told us a story about a woman who showed up at one of their meetings, and she's talked about in our report, and her name was Iris Long. And she had worked in a pharmaceutical company. I don't think she was a PhD level, but she was like a master's level chemist, and just took an interest in this area. I think, just had felt some sort of personal emotional pull to it. Showed up at one of the meetings, this housewife, sat in the back of the room, and they were talking about drug development, and she raised her hand and said, "You guys don't know what the hell you're talking about. I'll teach you." So she kind of joined this movement and became one of the educators. And so I thought that was very interesting, and Jim sort of pointed out how valuable that kind of expertise was. So I give that to all of you because, again, if you don't know things, there are people who know them. And so reach out to others, reach out to Faster Cures in terms of what you need to know. I think the hallmark of what you all are doing, what we have seen in the venture philanthropy community, these are disease research groups, many of them that you might recognize, like cystic fibrosis, the Michael J. Fox Foundation. Many of these groups share their information. Do they have time to sit down and do kind of a one-on-one tutorial? Probably not. But there are a lot of open source opportunities for you to learn. One other thing I'll have you look at on our website is called Train Central Station. So TRAIN is the loose affinity of these groups that we convene. It's not a coalition. It's called we sort of say it's the uncoalition coalition. There's no dues, but it's groups who are pioneering in this space. And so we've put up a lot of their best practices on that website. We run a webinar series on a variety of topics. So there's a way that you can sign up to get updates. So again, this was, a particular part of this epidemic that you had young people dying of an infectious disease. But knowing some of the stories in the room, I think that there are some parallels in terms of young people being impacted. Accountability is the next element. And I talked about this earlier, that this was an inside accountability and an outside accountability. This was a tough community. That not going to suffer fools gladly, not interested in dealing with petty issues. They had business to transact and get done. And so they really held themselves to a very high standard, but they held the outside world to a high standard too. And so they were, very transparent about what they were trying to get done, communicated very openly about it, but, really, they were about business and getting that done. And so the accountability piece was something that I think we felt was very important to impart, that if you don't know where you're going, you never know if you got there. So I say that to you to think about the metrics you're using for your success. What are you trying to get done? What are your goals? How are you going to get there? Who do you need as part of that process? And do they understand the expectations that you have of them? So this is a quote from Tony Fauci. And he talks about this issue of how they had the ability to get your attention, but then they had this phenomenal analysis of things. Another thing that was intriguing about this story that I hear a little bit about now in the life sciences is that I referenced you had people from Wall Street, you had people from all different walks of life and talents who were all coming to these issues and bringing their own backgrounds and perspectives. And that we hear about now in research, that when you bring physical scientists, mathematicians, engineers to the table, you get a whole different sort of view and perspective. So that was something that they did very early on, is that the activists said, well, why do you do it that way? Have you thought about doing it this way? And so don't ever underestimate your talents, your abilities to analyze an issue, your ability, if you're not a PhD, MD scientist, to have a perspective. And if you, find people who are not willing to listen, I think that the message from them was, find the next person to help you listen. But that is something that we are hearing more and more about now, is this idea of bringing in alternate perspectives, that the problems are tough right now in terms of medical research and some of the obstacles, and so you need different perspectives. And I think it's really a testament to Tony Fauci that he really was a pioneer at saying, let's bring everybody in and sit them at the table. I just had an opportunity to meet with him a couple of weeks ago, and he is still, just as passionate and committed as ever. In fact, now his goal is to have, in the United States, an AIDS-free generation, which it just shows that, so 33 drugs, that's not enough. We actually need to stop having people get infected. And so one of the ways in the HIV science world that they've seen the possibility of that is people who are in treatment, their viral load and their ability to be infectious dramatically drops. And so if people can be tested, so they know they're positive, and then get on treatment, they're less likely to transmit. So Tony is really pushing on that, and that, I think, is his sort of the thing that is motivating him every day to see if that can happen in his career and lifetime. The last thing is leadership. This is Maureen Burns, who was one of the first directors of the National Commission on AIDS, which is still a group that's going on. She worked on Capitol Hill. She was very smart herself. So this is an example where she was a congressional staffer, then she went to head a presidential commission. So you could look at her at face value and say, oh, she was co-opted by the system, or she's one of them. But no, she was very, much part of the movement, and I'm sure, was doing a lot of back and forth communications behind the scenes in terms of what needed to happen. So, just in terms of changing the system, yes, you had tens of thousands of people who were mobilized, who were activating. One of the things we spoke about last night is that if we look at all of our individual problems in a one-off fashion, I'm not convinced we're all ever going to get where we need to go. So it's figuring out, how do you all mobilize? What is the common agenda that you all share? So, you're going to hear later on today about some of the funding challenges at the agencies. I think that this is going to be used. I mean, they're going into almost like turtle mode, where they're pulling their head in, they're going to pull their legs in and kind of hunker down. You're going to hear from experts, I don't think the budget situation is going to get better anytime soon. It's going to get probably worse before it gets better. So I think that one strategy, and this is just off the top of my head, could be go to other rare cancer groups and see if you can't get 5 or 10 people and say, we need to have a meeting with the head of the NCI, because we need to address how are we going to deal with the fact that these are rare cancers. They're people. They're not high impact enough in terms of lung cancer. That's a 365,000 people a year cancer in terms of people who die, but it doesn't make yours any less significant. So, that would be one strategy. I'd be happy to brainstorm with you offline. I think in terms of the report, I didn't get into some of the kind of challenges, but I spoke a little bit about social media. So, we asked all of our interviewers about that issue. Is social media a help or a hindrance right now? And they were all kind of the mind that it was a little bit of both, that they didn't have that to deal with, so they didn't have people kind of doing infighting anonymously over the internet. They also physically had to get together, so it created that community. So that's something that you're probably not able to do, but maybe you would have been forced to do it 30 years ago. But they said it also provides the opportunity to spread the power a little bit more uniformly and gather more people that way to sort of create chat rooms and things like that. So if it's federal money that you're after, I think you're going to have to band together with a few other people and talk about what are you trying to get. Is it more focus? Is it across the NCI? What are all the elements that you could be hitting in terms of what they do? They're undergoing huge transition right now. I participated in a meeting a couple weeks ago. They're reviewing the cancer clinical trials infrastructure. And I have to tell you, I was sort of struck. It was a room of people who all built this infrastructure. And so I felt a little funny in my talk. I was talking about how other venture philanthropy groups are funding clinical trials. And I said, I don't know if any of you guys are even going to be here in 10 years in terms of your positions. You're all going to retire. And the system is breaking, and I don't even know if it's the right system. So you've got a little bit of that going on right now, too. There's a lot of cracks right now, and a lot of... Yeah, so you might need to put your hands into the crack and just start to pull it open a little bit more. So that's another interesting point, and I'm not fluent enough in all of the issues and the numbers, but if you look across the NIH, there's 27 institutes, and if you tallied up within each institute what is the component of their budget or their programs focused on rare, and then you put that together, it would be a lot more powerful. Are they going to create a rare institute? Probably not, because I think they're actually disinterested in more institutes. But they need, this is where the kind of internal, external accountability and leadership, which I think I might have skipped the leadership piece a little bit, but this is where that comes in, that they can't say some of this stuff from the inside. I mean, this is where you're going to need to find your champions within, figure out, well, what is it that they wish they could do that they can't do, and see what you can do there. I guess the other comment I would make about the NIH funding is many of the venture philanthropy groups that we have worked with were created because the NIH wasn't doing enough. They either didn't have enough numbers or they just weren't prioritizing that. I mean, even if I dial it back to the example I talked about in the beginning, Prostate Cancer Foundation, believe it or not, prostate cancer, it's either the #1 or #2 killer of men in the United States. When Prostate Cancer Foundation was created, it was not getting the attention that it gets now. And Mike Milken said, what's the problem? And they said, scientific talent. He said, okay, so if we create a private entity that gives grants to scientists and builds that scientific workforce up, then we're coming back and having a conversation about what needs to happen at NCI. So that's another thing for you to be thinking about. I'm not suggesting, I don't know what your organization is or what your model is, but there's an example, Chordoma Foundation, a guy, Josh Summer, he's late 20s, was diagnosed with chordoma, just a fireball of energy. And he had the same experience of NCI was not doing what needed to be done. So he created his group with his mom and basically has seeded that scientific energy in that field. And now, sort of really, I think, tipping it a little bit so that he's not only going to get the NCI's interest, but he's going to get the pharmaceutical interest too. Sure. So our organization tends to focus at maybe the 25 to 30,000 foot. So some of the things that we're going to focus on, I almost wouldn't want you to have to focus on because I'd rather see you get really specific and targeted. However, I would encourage you to come talk to Hugh Hempel, who shared a schematic last night that I think represented a lot of the issues that we talk about. So the 4 areas that we focus on: policy and process. We're based here in Washington, D.C. We do a lot around NIH funding. We're starting to look more at this systemic issue that I brought up of the NIH was built almost for yesterday, not for tomorrow, and I'm not convinced it's really in their power to change it versus an outside force saying, this is what needs to happen here, and it's not going to happen overnight, and I don't think I don't pretend that it will. That's one thing. I do think you have some visionary leadership there, in terms of Francis Collins, who is the right person for the job right now in terms of his ability to get people enthusiastic about science. The Food and Drug Administration, another area that we work on, both at the sort of finance level, but then at the programmatic level. So let me just give you my 2 cents, and you're going to hear from Steve Grossman later. And this is a group called the Alliance for a Stronger FDA that I just stepped down as the president of. So the agency's appropriated budget is about $2.5 billion. You add the user fees that drug companies pay to expedite the application process, and it goes up to about $4.1 billion. So can they be more efficient with their money? Of course. I can be more efficient with my money. I had to go, one of my resolutions for the new year was to quit buying, little jewels at H&M and things like that. So, and no more lipstick. So, everybody can be more efficient. But with an agency like that has responsibility of regulating 25 cents of every consumer dollar spent in the United States, their mission is rather vast. So they also just were given responsibility to oversee tobacco. They do food safety. So in the summer when there are contaminated, spinach outbreaks, cantaloupe, that's the Food and Drug Administration. And some of these programs have user fees, so they kind of get this extra boost of money to be able to get the job done. Others don't. So that adds to some of their burden. So we've been trying over the years to get them more appropriated dollars, and we've been successful at that. Now, they need to spend them well and spend them wisely. And it's a workforce of about 10,000 people. And, with 10,000 people, you're going to have variability. It's a highly skilled workforce by and large. And so one of the challenges they face in a human capital standpoint is those employees get poached because they get them trained, they get them ready to be good reviewers, and then somebody else says, "Oh, I need that expertise." So that's one of the policy process things that we work on. Real quickly, the 3 other things is how do you put patients at the center of all of this, which relates to what you all are doing. Collaboration, what are the models where we're seeing the different sectors in medical research working well together? Because I think now we're clearly at a point where they've all realized, oh my God, we can't do this alone. It's the heyday's over in terms of the low-hanging fruit. The science ahead of us is hard, and if they're not figuring out a way to collaborate, it's not going to work. And then the last piece is capital. New financing mechanisms. So we have this, valley of death, this lack of access to capital for phase 1, even phase 2. Venture capital has really shied away from this area. I'm not convinced it's ever coming back. So you have a variety of new financing vehicles, and we've got a few reports up on our site that you can take a look at. This is an area that we're going to focus on heavily, looking at what are some innovative models. There's big ideas out there about cancer bonds. Can you create kind of a for-profit investment opportunity to do good, to do socially good research? So those are the sort of high-level areas that we work on, and I'd be happy to share more with you. Some of the things that need to change are huge, and so it is a prioritization process. The clinical trial system, we saw in the documentary last night about privacy issues. I hate to say it, when I heard the stuff about HIPAA, I thought, I don't know, that's a big lift. So are there easier things that we can do besides overturning a law? And so some of that is going to take people saying, guys, this is ridiculous. Look what you did with this law that you didn't intend to do. This has to be fixed. And I think you are seeing signs where when pressure gets put on the system, it does react. It needs to react faster, most clearly. So I think that the trick on some of the companies that you referenced, some of the IT issues, I think it's more around the sharing of data. And if you think about the data that Facebook has on all of us, they know what restaurants I like, they know what my daughter is up to. The ridiculous amount of sharing and information grabbing that's going on there. Even CVS knows what kind of toilet paper I like to buy. And yet I can't go to the doctor and get my medical records transported unless I sort of make that very conscious act of doing it, and they're kind of nasty to me when I want them. So I think it's less about how do you get revenue dropped into it, and more about how do you bring them in as a collaborator. So the good news at the top level, if you all saw in the last week, there was a life science prize that was announced. This $3 billion, was it $3 billion or 33 million? That was a collaboration of Yuri Milner and Sergey Brin, his wife Ann Wojcicki, and Mark Zuckerberg. So first of all, they're a young tier of philanthropists, and they're all members of the Giving Pledge. They're all billionaires, and they are really understanding the power of data and the power of science. So I think you're going to see more of that. Again, I think there's power in numbers in terms of what's the ask, what is the opportunity that you want, and then I think there could be a real receptivity, but I think they're already starting to think about it. I'm not sure exactly, what it all looks like. I'm not an expert in this, but the mobile app area is another one that's on fire right now. And I think that we're still seeing that settle out in terms of what's going to be the most used, the most relevant. I mean, we've looked for years at Faster Cures at the electronic health record area. I have to tell you, it's one of the most frustrating communities out there in the policy sphere because it's all about standards. Okay, I get it. I get why we need that. But then you get kind of the pesky research voice in there saying, well, I like my blood pressure taken on the right arm, not the left arm. And if they're not the same in every patient, then I can't do my research. And I think you're starting to see examples like Patients Like Me as a company where patients are putting their information in, they're sharing it in a virtual setting, they're talking about it, and drug companies are buying the data. And they're saying, yeah, we want to know what's happening. We want to know what they're doing with that. So I think there's a little bit of a natural revolution going on already. I don't see why not. I mean, I don't know where it falls on the list of priorities for the group, but absolutely. I mean, I think we're not going to get there, sort of if we just focus on government, or we just focus on the pharmaceutical biotechs, or we just focus on the financing. It's really got to be this collective piece. So that's one of the things that we try to do at Faster Cures is understand who's doing that and then put a spotlight on it and say, all right, what are the elements of your model and how did you do that? And how can we save somebody else the time from having to go do it again?